Canada's forgotten blonde Bigfoot has the oldest newspaper trail in Sasquatch history. Somewhere in the endless boreal forest of the Canadian Shield, witnesses kept seeing the same impossible thing. A massive figure walking upright on two legs, a body covered in hair so dark it read as black against the spruce. And on its head something no other creature like it has ever been known to carry. A mane of pale, yellow blonde hair falling almost to its shoulders, like a crown. They called it Old Yellow Top. And here is what separates this creature from nearly every famous Sasquatch case you have ever heard of. It left a paper trail, not a blurry video, not a story told decades after the fact. An actual documented trail in a real newspaper of record, a trail that begins generations before anyone on this continent even had a word for what these witnesses were seeing. 4 major sightings, 64 years, 1 small mining town in northern Ontario, and 1 newspaper that kept writing it all down. The witnesses were not believers chasing a legend. They were miners, prospectors, a mother walking her son into town. Most of them never met each other. Some of them were not even born when the first report happened, and yet, across more than 6 decades, they all described the same thing. Dark body, light head, walks like a man.
I'm Alex, and on this channel we follow the evidence into the places where the official explanations run out. And I have to tell you, the file on this creature is one of the strangest I have ever opened. Because this story does not end quietly. It ends on a gravel road on a summer night in 1970 with a bus carrying 27 miners to the graveyard shift.
It ends with a creature stepping into the high beams, a driver slamming the brakes so hard the bus fishtailed toward the edge of a rock cut. 28 lives a few feet from going over. And then, after 64 years of sighting, something stranger than any encounter happened. Old Yellow Top vanished, completely. It was never reported again. Why does a creature haunt one town for 3 generations and then simply stop existing? To answer that, we have to go back to the very beginning. Back to 1903, when men first cut into this ancient rock looking for silver and woke something up. To understand why the story is even possible, you have to understand the place where it happened. The Canadian Shield is one of the oldest exposed sections of rock on planet Earth. Some of the stone around Cobalt, Ontario has been sitting there unchanged for over 2 billion years. It is a landscape of black spruce, granite outcrops, and 10,000 nameless lakes. Even today, it remains one of the most sparsely populated regions in North America. In 1900, it was a blank space on the map. Then, in 1903, everything changed. Contractors building the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway struck silver, not traces of silver. Veins of it running through the rock like frozen lightning. Within months, prospectors from across Canada and the United States were pouring into the wilderness. A boomtown exploded out of the forest almost overnight, and they named it Cobalt. By the outbreak of the First World War, the silver fields around this one small town had given up more than 32 million ounces of silver. Cobalt became, for a brief and feverish moment, one of the most important mining camps on Earth. Picture what that actually looked like on the ground. Thousands of men living in tents and tar paper shacks, head frames rising over shafts sunk straight into 2-billion-year-old stone, dynamite blasts echoing off the lakes at all hours. The town grew so fast it had no sewers, barely any streets, and a fortune passing through it every single day. The forest did not retreat from any of this. It simply stood at the edge of the clearings, black and silent, and waited. Step 50 feet past the last shack in any direction, and you were in wilderness that ran unbroken for hundreds of miles. Every man in that camp worked all day with his back to those trees. But here's the thing about boomtowns. They are built fast, in places men do not understand. surrounded by forest that has never been cleared, never been mapped, never been asked what it might be hiding. And the people who had lived in this country for thousands of years before the railway came, the Cree and the Ojibwa, already had stories about these woods, stories of wild giants, of hairy, primitive men who lived beyond the firelight and did not want to be found. Some of those traditions speak of an ancient race of robust, hair-covered people who waged war on the ancestors long ago, hunting not with bows but by running their prey down with raw strength. Other tales describe enormous wild men who traveled alone through the deep forest. The details shift from nation to nation, but the shape at the center of them does not. To be clear, those are legends passed down through oral tradition, and I am presenting them as exactly that. But it is worth sitting with this for a moment, long before a single prospector swung a pick into that rock. The oldest cultures on this land were already warning that something man-shaped lived out there. And in September of 1906, 3 years into the silver rush, the miners of cobalt found out for themselves.
Everything you're about to hear comes from a real newspaper. Real dates, real names, real printed articles. I will tell you exactly where the record is strong and exactly where it goes dark. And trust me, where it goes dark is the scariest part.
September 1906. East of the cobalt camp, a crew of men is building the headframe of the Violet mine. A headframe is the wooden winding tower that stands over a mine shaft, and raising one is loud, sweaty, dangerous work. These men were not wandering the forest looking for monsters. They were on a job site, in daylight, surrounded by co-workers, hauling timber, driving spikes, swearing at each other over the noise. The most ordinary scene imaginable. And at some point during that work, the crew noticed they were not alone. Standing in the trees at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden, was a huge, hairy figure, shaped like a man, sized like nothing human. It was not charging, it was not fleeing, it was watching them, studying them from partial concealment, the way a hunter studies something it does not yet understand. Think about the choice that figure was making. A construction site is the loudest, most chaotic place in the wilderness. Every animal in the country, every bear, every moose, every wolf, gives a work site a wide berth. The noise alone should have emptied those woods for a mile in every direction. This thing walked toward the noise. It found a vantage point, and it stayed. Word of the encounter tore through the silver fields. In a camp full of dynamite, cave-ins, and frozen winters, this was the story that men could not stop telling. It embedded itself so deeply into local memory that the region's newspaper would still be referencing it decades later. Now, the honesty beat, because this channel does not bury these. The 1906 sighting was not written up in the press at the time. We know about it because the North Bay Nugget, the paper of record for the region, retold it in detail years later. The names of those workers are lost. That is a real limitation in the record, and I am flagging it once, here, so we can move forward with clear eyes. But hold on to one detail from that lost first encounter, because it is going to come back again and again in this story. The creature was watching them work. I personally think that is the strangest thread in this entire case. Predators stalk, prey animals flee. This thing did neither, it observed. Across the whole construction of that mine, the crew reported seeing it again, sometimes at a distance, sometimes unsettlingly close, always watching. Whatever stood in those trees in 1906 was curious about us, and it would be 17 years before it stepped out of the tree line and into print. July 1923, 16 miles southeast of Cobalt, near the Wetlaufer mine, 2 prospectors are working their claims. Their names are J.A. Macaulay and Lorne Wilson. and they are exactly the kind of witnesses you want. Experienced woodsmen, men who had spent their lives around bears and knew precisely what a bear looks like. That is what makes what happened next so hard to dismiss. The two men spotted what they took to be a black bear sitting in a blueberry patch picking fruit from the bushes, a completely ordinary sight in northern Ontario in July. So ordinary that Wilson did something almost reckless in its casualness. He picked up a rock and he threw it at the animal. The thing in the blueberry patch stood up, not the way a bear rears briefly and unsteadily before dropping back to all fours. It stood up on two legs, turned, and growled at the men. And then it ran into the forest, out of sight, on two legs, running like a human runs. Understand why that detail matters so much, coming from these two men in particular. A black bear can stand. Every woodsman has seen it. But a bear standing is a tripod balancing act. Front paws tucked, swaying, lasting seconds. A bear cannot run upright. Its hips and spine are simply not built for it. There is no animal in the forests of Ontario that can rise from a sitting position and sprint away on two legs. Except, apparently, one. Wilson's own words were printed in the North Bay Nugget on July 27, 1923, and you can feel the bafflement in them a century later. "It sure was like no bear that I have ever seen," he told reporters. "Its head was kind of yellow and the rest of it was black like a bear, all covered with hair." And it matters which paper printed that quote. The Nugget was no tabloid. It had been founded in Cobalt itself during the boom as the Cobalt Nugget, before moving south to North Bay. It was the paper of record for the entire region, the one that covered the mine accidents, the silver prices, the train schedules. This story ran alongside the ordinary news of ordinary lives. The newspaper described the creature as ape-like, and it reported that locals had already given it a nickname because of that impossible light-colored mane. They called it Yellow Top. That same article is also where the 1906 Violet Mine encounter was finally written down in full, which tells you something remarkable. 17 years on, the people of Cobalt had never stopped talking about the Watcher in the trees. To them, 1923 was not a new mystery. It was the same one coming back. And the Nugget gave the creature a second name, a name I find genuinely chilling. They called it the Precambrian Shield Man. Think about what that name is actually saying. The Precambrian is the deepest stretch of Earth's history, the age of the 2-billion-year-old rock this region sits on. The newspaper of record looked at this creature and reached for the oldest word it had.
A man throws a rock at what he thought was a bear, but that bear stands up and runs away on two legs. That's the moment the whole legend was born. And the paper that printed it had no idea that they were documenting something the rest of the world wouldn't have a name for until 6 years later.
Now we arrive at the fact that made me want to make this video. The reason this case stands apart from 1,000 other sightings. The word Sasquatch did not exist in the public consciousness in 1923. The creature we now know by that name entered the wider world in April of 1929, when a writer named J.W. Burns published his famous article in Maclean's magazine, introducing readers to the wild hairy giants of British Columbia. That article lit the fuse on everything that followed. The legend, the hunts, the entire culture of Sasquatch. The Cobalt newspaper trail begins 6 years before that fuse was ever lit. Let me put 1923 in perspective for you. Radio was a novelty. Talking pictures did not exist yet. The word Bigfoot would not be coined for another 35 years, when a bulldozer operator in California found tracks around his machine in 1958. The Patterson-Gimlin film was 44 years away. There was no monster industry, no documentaries to imitate, no hoax templates to follow, and absolutely no fame or money waiting for a prospector who told a story like this. If anything, there was ridicule. When Lorne Wilson described a black-haired, yellow-headed giant standing up out of a blueberry patch, there was no template for him to copy, no cultural script for what he was seeing. These miners were describing something they had no cultural script for. And that is what makes this, as far as the documented record goes, the oldest sustained newspaper trail attached to a single one of these creatures anywhere in Sasquatch history. Not one article, a trail in one paper tracking one named creature across generations. We have seen this pattern before on this channel. When we opened the Soviet files on the wild men of the Russian wilderness, the same thing kept surfacing. Remote communities quietly reporting hairy giants decades before the outside world gave them vocabulary for it. Isolated people, with nothing to gain, describing the same animal. Skeptics will tell you that monsters spread like fashion, that people see what the culture has primed them to see. And in many cases, honestly, they're right. After the Patterson-Gimlin film hit the world in 1967, Sasquatch reports exploded everywhere, and plenty of them were clearly people seeing what television had taught them to see. But that argument has a built-in test. If sightings are cultural contagion, then sightings should not exist before the culture does. And the Cobalt file fails that test in the most spectacular way possible. It exists entirely on the wrong side of the timeline. But what primed a prospector in 1923? What primed a mine construction crew in 1906? The culture had not been built yet. There was nothing to imitate. I personally think this is the single most powerful piece of evidence in the entire Old Yellow Top file. The sightings predate the legend. The witnesses came first, and whatever they saw in those woods was not borrowed from anyone. 23 years pass. The silver boom fades, the easy veins run dry, and Cobalt shrinks from a roaring camp into a quiet northern town. The forest starts taking back the edges. Then, in the spring of 1946, Old Yellow Top returns to print. 4 miles southwest of Cobalt sat a small railway settlement called Gillies Depot, a handful of buildings clustered around a station of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway. From there, the rail line ran along the shore of Gillies Lake toward town. A mother and her young son were walking those tracks into Cobalt to do the family's weekly shopping. It was early spring, and she was already on edge, watching for bear cubs and the protective mothers that come with them. Hold that scene in your mind because it is the most intimate sighting in this entire file. No mine, no machinery, no crew of men, just a woman and a child alone on 4 miles of railway track, with the bush pressing close on either side and the snow barely off the ground. Then a large shadow moved at the edge of her vision, heading toward the bush near the lake. The North Bay Nugget printed her account that April. Old Yellow Top, the article declared, the half-man, half-beast that is supposed to be roaming the wilds around the Cobalt mining camp was reportedly seen again. The woman described a dark, hairy animal with a light head, ambling off the tracks and into the bush. She admitted she did not get a clear look, but she said the thing walked, in her words, almost like a man. Notice what she did not do. She did not give her name. She specifically asked the paper to keep it out of print. This was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and she clearly understood what gets attached to people who report things like this. That, to me, reads like a reluctant witness. And reluctant witnesses are the credible kind. The article ended with a line that still gives me chills. It announced that a search party might be formed to go out and find Old Yellow Top. That search party never went into the woods. As far as the record shows, no one in Cobalt ever went looking. A town announces it might hunt down its monster and then quietly, collectively decides not to. And think about who these people were. This was not a town of timid city folk. Cobalt was full of men who worked 1,000 feet underground by lamplight, men who handled dynamite for a living, hunters who walked into bear country every autumn without a second thought. Courage was the local currency. Those men read in their own newspaper that the half-man, half-beast was back, walking the tracks their wives and children used, and not one of them picked up a rifle and went out to settle a question. Maybe it was practicality, or maybe deep down, nobody actually wanted to find out what had been walking their tracks for 40 years. Now, they never went looking, but you can. Everything in this video comes from a documented trail you can chase yourself, and I will tell you exactly where to start at the end. If these forgotten files are why you are here, do me one favor right now, hit subscribe and tap the bell. We dig up a buried case like this every single week, and the next one, I promise you, goes somewhere even darker. Comments are open too. If you grew up in Northern Ontario, if your family has a story from those woods, I read every single one, and some of your comments have already become full videos on this channel. Every story like this has its centerpiece. The night the legend stopped being a story in a newspaper and stepped physically into the road. For Old Yellowtop, that night came on August 4th, 1970. 3 miles southwest of Cobalt, a gravel road wound through the forest toward the Cobalt Lode mine. Working that route was a bus driver named Amy Latrell, and his job was simple: carry the night crew out to the mine for the graveyard shift. He had made that same drive nearly every evening for 4 months. He knew every curve of that road in the dark. 4 months. Call it well over 100 trips down the same 3 miles of gravel, out and back, night after night. Nothing had ever stepped out of these trees. That is what makes a route like that dangerous in a way. It teaches you that nothing ever will. On board that night were 27 miners, hard men at the start of a long shift, half asleep against the windows as the headlights swept the tree line. Then a dark figure loomed out of the roadside forest and lumbered directly into the glare of the high beams. At first I thought it was a big bear, Latrell later told a reporter, but then it turned to face the headlights and I could see some light hair almost down to its shoulders. It couldn't have been a bear. Sit with that image for a second. The creature did not bolt across the road. It turned, it faced the headlights. For one suspended moment, a busload of miners and the Precambrian shield man looked at each other. Latrell slammed on the brakes. On gravel, at speed, the bus broke loose and fishtailed wildly, sliding toward the edge of a rock cut. 28 men came within a few feet of a plunge that the local paper described as potentially fatal. By the time Latrell wrestled the bus back under control, the creature had finished its crossing and melted into the trees on the far side of the road. Gone. The story ran in the North Bay Nugget the very next day, August 5th, 1970. And this time the paper did not have one anonymous witness. It had a named driver and a bus full of corroborating miners. One of those passengers, a miner named Larry Cormack, gave his own account. "It looked like a bear to me at first," he said, "but it didn't walk like one. It was kind of half stooped over. Maybe it was a wounded bear. I don't know." You can hear a man negotiating with himself in that quote, reaching for the safe explanation and feeling it fall apart in his own mouth. A wounded bear does not walk upright across a road on 2 legs. But it is the other 2 quotes from that article that elevate this from a sighting into something generational. Latrell, the driver. "I have heard of this thing before, but never believed it. Now I am sure." He added that he honestly did not know if he would keep driving that road. Read that quote again. This is a working man talking to his local paper, telling the whole region that he might give up his job over what he saw. There is no version of a prank, a payout, or a tall tale that ends with a bus driver publicly questioning whether he can drive a road he has driven 100 times. And Cormac, when a reporter asked if the creature might have been Old Yellow Top, "My father used to talk about it, but I've seen it close up." Picture the scene at the cobalt lode mine that night when the bus finally rolled in late. 27 men climbing down the steps, looking back over their shoulders at the dark road. An entire graveyard shift spent underground, knowing what was walking around up there in the trees above them. My father used to talk about it. One sentence, and the entire 64-year span of this case collapses into a single family. The legend his father told him at the kitchen table walked in front of his bus. That is what a 64-year paper trail actually means when it touches the ground. It means the witnesses of 1970 were raised on the witnesses of 1923. Cormac did not learn about Old Yellow Top from a TV show or a magazine. He learned about it the way you learn the names of the lakes and the roads from his father as a plain fact of the country he lived in. And then one summer night, the plain fact of the country stepped into his headlights and stooped through the high beams, close enough to count the hairs of its mane.
27 miners and a driver, and the thing in the headlights didn't run. It turned and looked at them. Whatever you believe about this case, that moment was real enough to nearly put a bus off a cliff. But now we have to do what this channel always does. We have to look at the other explanation, the one the skeptics put on the table. Because in this case, the skeptics were not outsiders. They were sitting inside the newspaper office itself.
The reporter who wrote up the 1970 incident ended the story with a joke, suggesting the mysterious pedestrian might have been a rowdy patron wandering home from a local saloon. And when the legendary Sasquatch researcher John Green looked into the case for his 1971 book On the Track of Sasquatch, he read that joke as a signal. The paper itself did not take the story seriously. Green's associate, a man named Bill Davis, went further. He made inquiries directly at the Nugget office, and the journalists there told him plainly that they regarded the whole tale as a miner's prank. So let us give that theory its full, honest weight. Mining towns run on tall tales. Bored men on night shifts love a good hoax, and a local monster is wonderful for morale and even better for newspaper sales. If Old Yellow Top was a running joke that the Nugget dusted off every couple of decades, it would not be the first time a town kept a legend alive for fun. That is the rational story. And if this were one sighting in 1 year, I might even close the file on it. But here's where the prank theory starts to creak. A prank needs a prankster. So who is he? Who dresses up to fool a mine construction crew in 1906 in a remote camp where being mistaken for an animal could get you shot? Who then waits 17 years to stage a second appearance for 2 random prospectors in a blueberry patch 16 miles away? Who frightens an anonymous mother on the railway tracks in 1946? And then waits another 24 years to step in front of a speeding bus on a dark gravel road at the exact spot where the slightest misjudgment means being run down or sending 28 men over a rock cut. That is not one prank. That is a 64-year relay race of pranksters spanning 3 generations with no confession, no slip-up, and no motive that survived any of them. And the 1970 incident, in particular, breaks the prank theory on physics alone. Whoever stood in front of that bus was gambling with 28 lives, including his own. The bus genuinely fishtailed toward a rock cut. If this was a man in a costume, he chose a stunt that came within feet of a mass casualty accident for an audience of miners with no camera anywhere. No prank in history has worked that hard for that little. And notice something else. The Nugget journalists called it a prank in 1970 with a wink and a saloon joke. But their own paper had been printing the sighting since 1923 and treating the 1906 account as established local history. If it was always a joke, it was a joke the newspaper itself spent half a century keeping deadly straight. I personally think the prank theory explains the laughter in the newsroom and explains absolutely nothing that happened on those roads and tracks and claim sites. The witnesses were not laughing. The woman on the tracks hid her name. Latreille questioned whether he could keep doing his job. Those are not the fingerprints of men and women in on a gag. So the question stays open, and honestly, it gets stranger from here. Because Old Yellowtop is not the only creature of its kind. There is a pattern, and it stretches across the roof of the world. In 1999, cryptozoologists Lauren Coleman and Patrick Haju published the Field Guide to Bigfoot, Yeti, and other mystery primates worldwide, an attempt to sort the planet's wildman reports into distinct types based on consistent physical traits. And when they came to Old Yellowtop, they did not file it with the classic Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest. They placed it into a category of its own. They called these creatures the marked hominids. The name has a double meaning. It honors Mark A. Hall, the researcher who first noticed this subgroup. But it also comes from a creature reported in western Siberia, which the local Mansi people called Machani. In their language, the word means exactly this, the marked one. Witnesses described its reddish-brown coat broken by a single anomalous patch of white fur. Marked hominids in Coleman and Haju's framework share a signature, two-toned, mismatched coloring, a dark body carrying a patch or mane of startlingly light hair. They stand around 7 feet tall, and their reports cluster in one kind of country, the cold subarctic forests at the top of the world. Now line that profile up against the cobalt record. Witness descriptions of Old Yellowtop consistently put it around 7 feet tall, possibly taller, with a build that some accounts estimated at close to 400 pounds. Body hair black or near black, and the mane, the one detail every witness agreed on across 64 years, falling pale and yellow almost to its shoulders. The cobalt witnesses had never heard of a classification system. They were just describing what crossed their roads. And what they described, decades before anyone built the category, fits the marked hominid profile point for point. If that Siberian thread sounds familiar, it should. We walked deep into that territory in our video on the Soviet expeditions, where the Russian wilderness produced its own decades of wildman files. Different continent, same latitude, same kind of creature. And Old Yellowtop has an even closer cousin on the far eastern edge of the very same Canadian Shield. In the wilds of Labrador, witnesses described a creature that came to be known as the traverspine gorilla, and they reported one unforgettable detail, a shock of white hair standing on the crown of its head. Labrador, like Cobalt, was frontier country with a tiny population, no monster culture, and nothing to gain from a hoax. And yet there it is in the record of an isolated settlement on the opposite end of the Shield. Another upright walker, another dark body, another impossible crown of pale hair. Two creatures, 2,000 miles apart, opposite ends of the same ancient slab of pre-Cambrian rock. Both walking upright, both dark-bodied, both crowned in light hair. I personally think this is the detail that should keep you up tonight. Hoaxes are local, pranks are local. But nobody coordinates a costume across Siberia, Labrador, and Northern Ontario across decades, among witnesses who will never meet and have never heard of each other. Either the cold edges of our maps keep independently inventing the exact same impossible animal, or something with a marked coat genuinely walks those forests. The pattern is real, the explanation is missing. And that brings us back to Cobalt, and to the question this entire case dead ends into. After August 4th, 1970, the record goes silent. No fifth article, no new witnesses on the tracks. No more figures in the high beams. The creature that haunted one town for 64 years across the entire arc of the Silver Age simply stopped. The clippings themselves almost vanished too. They survived because the Canadian researcher René de Hinden tracked them down and mailed them to his counterpart John Green, who preserved them in his 1971 book On the Track of Sasquatch. Two men passing a stack of yellowed newspaper articles between them like evidence in a cold case, which I personally think is exactly what it is. The mines wound down, the town kept shrinking. Today, fewer than 1,000 people live in Cobalt, and the forest has swallowed most of what the boom built. Out in the bush, the old head frames still stand, gray wooden towers rotting quietly over flooded shafts. Monuments to the men who once felt eyes watching them from the tree line. You can still walk the railway grade past Gillies Lake, where the mother and her son saw the shadow leave the tracks. You can still drive the back roads toward the old Cobalt Lode property. The geography of every sighting in this file is real, intact, and almost exactly as empty as it was in 1906. So what do we make of the silence? Maybe the skeptics are right and the town simply outgrew its prank. But there is another possibility, and it is the one I cannot stop thinking about. 64 years is a lifespan. If a single creature watched the Violet Mine crew as a young animal in 1906, it would have been old, perhaps very old when it stepped in front of that bus in 1970. Half stooped over, as Larry Cormack said, moving slow, turning to stare into the lights instead of running. Maybe what 27 miners saw that night was not an appearance at all. Maybe it was a farewell. One last crossing before the Precambrian shield man walked into the bush and lay down somewhere in 2 billion years of rock, in country so vast that no search party would ever have found him anyway. Not that they ever went looking, they never did, remember that. And Old Yellow Top may not even be the strangest thing in those hills. Just east of town lies Lake Temiskaming, long, narrow, and unnaturally deep. And the people of that shore tell of something that lives in its black water. That file is already open on my desk, and we will walk down to that lake together in a future video. But for tonight, picture that gravel road one more time. The dark, the high beams, the trees pressing in on both sides. Somewhere out there, the record insists, something with a crown of yellow hair turned to look at us one last time before it stepped out of history. The road is still there, the forest is still there, and the headlights still sweep that tree line every night, waiting.
64 years in print, 4 sightings, 1 town, and then silence. The oldest newspaper trail in Sasquatch history just ends suddenly. What do you think is the reason for that? I'm Alex, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.